After my college graduation, I quietly moved my grandparents' $1 million estate into a trust, and no one in my family knew. I didn't do it for money. I did it because of what they did to the two people who raised me. Stay with me, because once you hear what happened, you'll understand why I had no choice. My name is Sarah Collins, I'm 23 years old, and just last month, I walked across the stage at the University of Wisconsin to get my degree. That moment was supposed to be about celebrating my hard work and the people who made it possible. For me, those people weren't my parents. They were my grandparents, George and Elaine Collins. I grew up in a quiet little farming town where the air smelled of fresh hay in summer and would smoke in winter. My parents left when I was only 4, chasing new opportunities and never looking back. George and Elaine didn't think twice. They took me in, gave me a home, and worked themselves to the bone to make sure I never felt unwanted. They owned a farmhouse with white shutters and a wraparound porch, surrounded by acres of green field. It wasn't just land to them, it was their life's work. For decades, they woke up before dawn, planting, harvesting, repairing fences, and slowly paying off every penny of that property. Now, after all those years, it's worth over $1 million. To anyone else, it might just be a number. To me, it's my grandparents' blood, sweat, and tears in the soil. But not everyone in the family saw it that way. My Aunt Linda Cooper, my mother's sister, and her husband Wayne have always treated me like a problem. They never said it outright, but their little digs were constant. Well, Sarah's practically an only child now, guess she gets everything. You know, fairness matters. One day you'll have to make things right. Or my personal favorite, you owe this family more than you realize. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe they were just jealous that I had such a close bond with George and Elaine. But as I got older, I started noticing how their eyes lingered on the farmhouse, how their voices would drop when talking about future plans. The day of my graduation party, the air felt strange. The backyard was filled with neighbors, relatives, laughter, and the smell of grilled burgers, but underneath it all, there was tension. Linda kept whispering to Wayne, and every time I looked their way, they stopped talking. George seemed distracted, smiling at guests but glancing toward the house now and then. Elaine stayed close to him, like she was making sure he was okay. I didn't know it yet, but that night was the beginning of a fight I never thought I'd have to face. One that would decide whether my grandparents kept the home they built or lost it to the very people who should have loved them. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow across the backyard as the graduation party carried on. Music played softly, kids ran through the grass, and the scent of barbecue still hung in the air. I was standing by the drink table, talking with a couple of neighbors, when I noticed Linda and Wayne quietly motioning for my grandparents to join them. They moved toward the far corner of the yard, away from everyone else. Something about their body language caught my attention. Linda was leaning in close to Elaine, her hand resting lightly on George's arm in a way that seemed rehearsed. I couldn't hear everything, but as I stepped closer, their voices drifted over the breeze. Signing before it's too late, Linda said in a low tone. Wayne added, "It's best to make it official now so there's no confusion later." My stomach tightened. I didn't know exactly what they were talking about, but the words had a sharp edge to them, like a hidden threat dressed up as advice. I took a step forward and called out, "Everything okay over here?" Elaine looked at me quickly, almost startled. "Oh yes, dear," she said, forcing a smile. But her voice wavered and her eyes flickered toward the ground. George stayed quiet, his jaw tight, like he was weighing something he didn't want to say out loud. The moment passed quickly, and Linda smoothly redirected the conversation to the food, gushing about the potato salad like nothing had happened. Still, I couldn't shake the unease creeping into my chest. The party went on into the evening. Guests began leaving, hugging me and offering congratulations, their laughter fading into the night. By the time the last neighbor left, the house was quiet except for the clinking of dishes in the kitchen as Elaine cleaned up. I was heading down the hall to my room when I noticed the light was on in the home office. I slowed my steps and peeked in. Linda was there, alone, with her back to me. She was rifling through the top drawer of the desk, papers spilling onto the surface. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She turned quickly, plastering on a smile. "Oh, Sarah, I was just looking for a pen. I wanted to leave a note for your grandparents before Wayne and I head out." But my eyes had already locked onto the papers in her hand, thick, official-looking documents bound together with a clip. From where I stood, I could make out lines of typed text, small legal stamps, and George and Elaine's names printed in bold. Something inside me told me not to push further right then. I forced a polite smile, stepped aside, and let her pass. She left the room with that same practiced warmth, but I stayed behind, staring at the desk. Whatever those papers were, I knew one thing for certain: I needed to find out. And soon. A week later, I was driving my grandparents to their routine medical checkup in town. The air was cool that morning, and the fields along the road were just starting to show signs of spring. George sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, while Elaine hummed softly in the back. Everything felt calm, almost normal, until Elaine spoke. "Oh, Sarah," she said casually, "your Aunt Linda dropped off some papers the other day. She called it a property transfer form. Said it would make things easier for everyone." I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "Easier how?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Oh, Elaine continued. She said it was just in case something happened to us. That way the property could go straight to her and Wayne without a lot of trouble." She chuckled faintly, like she wasn't sure if it was a joke or not. I didn't answer right away. My mind was spinning. A property transfer form? That wasn't just some casual piece of paper. That was the kind of document that could change ownership entirely. At the clinic, I dropped them off at the entrance and parked the car. I told them I'd wait in the lobby, but as soon as they went inside, I pulled out my phone. My heart was pounding as I typed into the county property records search. It didn't take long before I found it, a pending deed transfer, dated just 3 days earlier. The current owners were listed as George and Elaine Collins. The transferees? Linda and Wayne Cooper. I stared at the screen, reading the details over and over. It hadn't been officially filed yet, but the form was complete, ready to go. It even had the legal descriptions of the farmhouse and every acre of land attached to it. My stomach churned. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a friendly suggestion. Linda and Wayne weren't just talking about future plans. They were trying to take the estate now, while my grandparents were still alive, and they were disguising it as help. I thought back to the strange conversation at my graduation party, the way Linda had been digging through the office drawers, the stack of papers clutched in her hand. It all fit together now. They were working behind the scenes, probably counting on George and Elaine's trust to slip a signature in without them realizing the full consequence. I felt a heat rise in my chest, a mix of anger and fear. The idea of them stealing the very home my grandparents had built with their bare hands made me sick. One thing became clear to me right then. I wasn't going to let it happen. I didn't care if they called me ungrateful, dramatic, or worse. This farm was more than property. It was my grandparents' life, and I would protect it, no matter what it took. Over the next 2 weeks, Linda and Wayne seemed to be everywhere. They stopped by the farmhouse almost every other day, always arriving with someone new in tow, a financial advisor, an estate planner, a retirement specialist. Each time, the pattern was the same. They'd sit at the kitchen table with George and Elaine, spread out folders and forms, and talk in slow, careful voices like they were explaining something to children. I tried to be present during these meetings, but Linda always found a way to get me out of the room. "Sarah, could you go check on the laundry? Or would you mind helping Wayne bring in the groceries?" When I returned, the conversations would already be wrapping up, papers half-signed, and my grandparents looking a little dazed. Their language was subtle but sharp. Linda would say things like, "Sarah's young. She'll move on with her life, maybe even live somewhere else. But we'll still be here, taking care of the place." Wayne would nod solemnly, adding, "We just want to make sure it's handled properly, for everyone's sake." It was manipulation wrapped in kindness. I could see it, but my grandparents were too polite to push back. Then I started noticing smaller, more disturbing patterns. George's blood pressure pills went missing for 3 days, only to show up in the wrong cupboard. Elaine's appointment cards for the doctor got misplaced, and when she found them again, the dates were suddenly written wrong. There were moments when Linda would tell George something in the morning, and later in the day, she'd insist he had agreed to it, even though I knew he hadn't. It was all meant to chip away at their confidence, to make them question their own memory, to make them feel like they couldn't manage on their own. One afternoon, the tension reached a breaking point. Linda was pushing yet another stack of planning documents across the table, speaking in that overly patient tone that made my skin crawl. George, who had been quiet all morning, finally snapped. "I've told you, Linda, I don't want to sign anything until I've thought it through." His voice was loud, and the flush on his cheeks was deep. Linda's smile didn't falter, but her tone turned icy. "Dad, I'm only trying to help before it's too late." George's breathing quickened, and his hand went to his chest. My heart lurched. I rushed to his side, helping him to a chair as Elaine fetched his medication. His pulse was fast, his face pale. That was the moment it hit me. They weren't just trying to get the property. They were creating stress, sowing doubt, and wearing my grandparents down until they could claim they were incapable of managing their own affairs. In other words, they were building a case for guardianship. And if I didn't act soon, they just might succeed. That night, after making sure my grandparents were resting, I sat in my room with my laptop open, staring at the screen. My mind kept circling back to one question. Who could I trust to help me stop this? Then I remembered a name George had mentioned before, Michael Turner. He was a well-known estate attorney in our county and had been friends with my grandfather for over 30 years. The next morning, I called his office. When I explained who I was, his voice warmed instantly. George's granddaughter? I haven't seen him in ages. What's going on? I hesitated for only a moment before telling him everything. The surprise visits, the planning documents, the suspicious property transfer. Michael didn't interrupt. He just listened, the way someone does when they've heard this kind of story before. Bring me whatever paperwork you can get your hands on, he said firmly. I'll take a look. 2 days later, I met him at his office in town, a small brick building with shelves of thick law books lining the wall. I handed over copies I had quietly made of the forms Linda had brought. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the pages, and his expression darkened. This, he said, tapping the top page, is predatory garbage. I've seen this tactic too many times. Someone pressures elderly family members to sign over assets, using vague legal terms to hide what's really happening. If your grandparents signed this, they'd lose full ownership of the farm immediately. My stomach sank, but Michael wasn't finished. The best way to stop this is to make the property untouchable. I recommend putting it into a living trust, with your grandparents as the trustee. That way, they keep complete control for as long as they're alive. You, he added, looking directly at me, would be the successor trustee, meaning you take over only if they can't manage it anymore. No one can override that without a court order. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. And that would stop Linda and Wayne? It would stop anyone, he said. But you need to act quickly. If they're already preparing documents, they might try to push for signatures soon. I nodded, feeling both relieved and anxious. This was a solid plan, but I knew convincing George and Elaine wouldn't be easy. George hated legal paperwork and still believed in handling family matters with trust and handshake. Elaine, while more cautious, didn't like the idea of making decisions behind her sister's back. But time wasn't on our side. Every day we waited was another day Linda and Wayne could make their move. As I left Michael's office, I looked down the street toward the quiet horizon, my resolve hardening. If my grandparents hesitated, I'd have to find the right words, because this was more than a legal matter now. It was about protecting the only home I'd ever truly known. It was a calm evening at the farmhouse, the kind where the sky glows deep orange before fading into soft blue. George was in his recliner reading the local paper, and Elaine sat on the couch knitting, the soft click of her needles filling the room. I stood in the doorway for a moment, my heart pounding. This was the conversation I'd been dreading. I took a deep breath and walked in. Grandpa, Grandma, I began, settling into the armchair across from them. There's something important we need to talk about, and it's not going to be easy. George lowered his paper and gave me a curious look. What's on your mind, kiddo? I started from the beginning, the whispers at my graduation party, the papers Linda had been carrying that night, the property transfer I found in the county record. I laid out every detail, trying to keep my voice steady. When I mentioned the pending deed transfer into Linda and Wayne's names, George's face tightened. No, he said firmly, shaking his head. Linda wouldn't do that. She's my daughter. I swallowed hard. I wish I could believe that, Grandpa. But the documents are real. I've seen them. Michael Turner has seen them. If you'd signed, the farm would already be in their hands. He leaned back, his eyes clouded, like he was struggling to reconcile two different truths. I raised her better than that, he muttered. Elaine set down her knitting and looked at me, her expression more resigned than surprised. George, I've noticed things. The way she talks about money, the way she watches the land. She's always been self-interested. I just didn't think she'd go this far. George looked at her, almost hurt. Why didn't you say anything? Because I didn't want to believe it either, Elaine said softly. I reached into my bag and pulled out the trust documents Michael had prepared. This is how we stop it, I said, placing them on the coffee table. It's called a living trust. You keep full control of the farm as long as you're alive. You can still sell it, lease it, do whatever you want. The only difference is that it's legally protected. No one can take it without a judge's order. When you're gone, it comes to me, but only because you chose that. George picked up the papers, flipping through them slowly. I don't like locking up family matters in legal red tape. I know, I said gently, but this isn't about red tape. It's about making sure you have the final say. Not Linda. Not Wayne. The discussion stretched late into the night. George asked questions about every clause. Elaine wanted to know how it would affect their day-to-day life. There were pauses, arguments, even moments of silence where I thought they'd refuse. Finally, George set the papers down and looked at me. All right, he said quietly. We'll do it. Relief washed over me. The hardest part was over. Now it was time to act. The next morning, I called Michael Turner and told him my grandparents were ready. His tone was brisk but encouraging. Good. The sooner we do this, the less chance there is for interference. From that point, Everything had to be done quietly. We agreed to meet at his office after hours so no one would notice George and Elaine coming in during the day. That evening, we drove into town, keeping it casual, just another trip to pick up some groceries. Inside Michael's office, the paperwork was already laid out, neatly organized in labeled folders. Michael went through each document slowly, making sure George and Elaine understood every detail. They signed with steady hands, and I witnessed each signature. By the end, the deed to the farmhouse and surrounding land had been legally transferred into the Collins Family Living Trust, with my grandparents as trustees and me as the successor trustee. The property was now protected from any outside takeover, but the trust was just one part of the plan. We had to make sure nothing else could be accessed without their knowledge. That meant moving certain sensitive documents, birth certificates, wills, insurance policies, out of the house. The next day, I drove my grandparents to the local bank, where we rented a safe deposit box. Everything important went inside, locked away where no one could accidentally stumble upon. Michael also advised us to redirect mail related to financial accounts and property records. That way, even if Linda or Wayne came snooping around the mailbox, they'd find nothing. I set up a private P.O. box in town under my name and arranged for statements to be sent there. It was a small detail, but it closed one more door they might try to open. Throughout all of this, Linda and Wayne seemed blissfully unaware. They still called every few days, pretending to check in on my grandparents, occasionally dropping hints about when they might stop by. I kept my responses short, never giving away what we were doing. One afternoon, Linda actually showed up unannounced, smiling wide as she brought over a pie. I thanked her politely and kept her in the living room, away from the office and kitchen, where my grandparents' files used to be. She chatted about how it's always good to have a plan for the future, her tone syrupy sweet, completely clueless that her plan had already been dismantled. By the end of the week, every safeguard was in place. The trust was official, the deed was secure, the documents were protected, and our most sensitive accounts were out of reach. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were ahead of them. Linda and Wayne still thought they had the upper hand, and that false sense of confidence was exactly what I needed them to have. Because when the truth finally came out, it would hit them like a brick. It happened on a Friday afternoon. The sky was gray, the kind of heavy, overcast day that makes the air feel tense before anything even happened. I was in the kitchen with Elaine, helping her slice apples for a pie, when the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway caught our attention. Elaine peeked out the window and stiffened. It's Linda and Wayne, and they're not alone. I joined her at the window just in time to see a man in a suit climbing out of the back seat, clearly a lawyer, judging by the briefcase in his hand. My stomach tightened. They didn't bother knocking. Linda swept into the living room with a bright, false smile, Wayne right behind her, the lawyer trailing like a shadow. Mom, Dad, Linda began, her voice overly cheerful. We finally brought the final paperwork, so we can get everything in order. It's just a formality now. George appeared from the hallway, moving slowly but steady. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood tall, facing them with a calm expression that almost looked like amusement. No need for paperwork, he said evenly. The property's already in a trust. The words landed like a thunderclap. Linda's smile vanished, her face draining of color. Wayne's head snapped toward George. What? Since when? Who authorized this? George glanced at me, his eyes warm but firm. She did. Sarah made sure our home stays ours. Wayne's face turned red. You let her meddle in legal matters she doesn't understand, he barked. Before George could answer, Linda's composure cracked completely. This is manipulation, she shouted, pointing at me. You've poisoned them against their own family. Do you have any idea what you've done? I didn't speak. I just stood there, letting her words bounce off me. For once, I didn't need to defend myself. The truth had already been spoken. Elaine, who had been quiet until now, set her knife down and stepped into the room. She looked straight at her sister, her voice steady but sharp. No, Linda. What you've done is try to take what isn't yours. You've been circling this house like a vulture, and I've kept my mouth shut for too long. Linda opened her mouth to argue, but Elaine cut her off. You will not bully us. You will not pressure us. And you will not set foot in this house again if you're going to treat us like prey. The room went silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Wayne muttered something under his breath, but Linda grabbed her purse and turned for the door. The lawyer, clearly uncomfortable, followed without a word. We watched from the window as they drove away, the taillights disappearing down the gravel road. George exhaled slowly and looked at me. Good work, kiddo, he said. You've saved our home. For the first time in weeks, the air inside the farmhouse felt lighter. After that day, Linda and Wayne disappeared from our lives almost entirely. No phone calls, no surprise visits, not even a polite holiday card. It was as if they had cut an invisible line between us, leaving nothing but silence on their end. Of course, silence didn't mean peace for them. Word travels fast in a small town, and soon enough, whispers started to reach us. I heard through neighbors that Linda was telling anyone who would listen that I had schemed my way into controlling the family estate. Wayne claimed I had manipulated George and Elaine while they were too old to know better. At first, I thought the rumors might get to me, but they didn't. I knew the truth, and more importantly, George and Elaine knew it too. The people who mattered most were safe and on my side. That was all I cared about. Without Linda and Wayne hovering over them, my grandparents seemed to shed years of stress in just a few weeks. George's color returned, and the deep lines in his forehead eased. Elaine's hands, which had always trembled slightly when she was nervous, grew steady again. The constant worry that had been weighing them down was gone, replaced by a calm they hadn't felt in a long time. I found myself spending more time at the farm than ever. On sunny mornings, Elaine and I would work side by side in her vegetable garden, pulling weeds and planting rows of beans, tomatoes, and carrots. She'd hum old folk songs while she worked, and every so often, she'd share stories from her childhood. Tales I'd never heard before because, for the first time in years, she seemed truly relaxed enough to talk. Afternoons were for helping George with repairs around the property. The old red barn needed new boards in places, and we worked together, climbing ladders and hammering nails until the sun dipped low. He'd tell me about when he first bought the land, about the storms they'd survived and the crops they'd grown. There was pride in his voice, not the pride of owning something valuable, but of having built something worth protecting. Evenings became my favorite part of the day. After dinner, we'd sit on the porch, sipping iced tea and watching the fireflies blink across the field. Sometimes we'd talk, other times we'd just enjoy the quiet. It was a kind of peace that had been missing for far too long. The farmhouse felt warmer, the air lighter, the silence comfortable rather than tense. I knew the outside world might still be buzzing with gossip, but here, in this small bubble of safety and love, none of it mattered. We had made it through the storm, and the land my grandparents had spent their lives building was still theirs, untouched, unshaken, and more secure than ever. And for the first time in months, life truly felt our own again. A year slipped by quietly, marked by the rhythm of farm life and the comfort of shared routine. George's health had stayed steady through most of it, though I could see him slowing down, not in spirit, but in the way he moved, the way he lingered in his favorite chair a little longer after chores. Then one crisp autumn morning, I found him still there, his head tilted slightly as if he'd just drifted into a nap. But his chest was still. He had passed in his sleep, peaceful and at home, exactly where he wanted to be. The days that followed felt heavy and unreal. Friends and neighbors came by with casseroles, flowers, and quiet condolences. Elaine stayed strong for everyone else, her back straight and her voice steady, though I knew the loss had carved deep into her. We planned the funeral together, simple, heartfelt, just as George would have wanted. Linda came. She arrived late, wearing a black dress and an expression that was unreadable. She kept her distance, speaking in clipped, polite tones to others, but never once bringing up the trust or the past year's event. I half expected a confrontation, some simmering resentment to bubble over, but it never came. Maybe the fight had gone out of her, or maybe she had finally realized that the battle was lost before it even began. During the service, Elaine sat beside me, her hand clasped tightly around mine. We listened as the pastor spoke of George's devotion to his family, his work ethic, and his love for the land. The words felt like they filled the whole chapel, warm, steady, and true. After the burial, people gathered in the farmhouse for coffee and pie, just as George would have insisted. The air was full of quiet conversations, the scent of cinnamon, and the sound of chairs creaking on the old wooden floor. At one point, Elaine leaned in close, her eyes glassy but steady, and whispered, "You saved us." He knew it. Her voice caught just slightly at the end, but she didn't look away. It was then I realized this hadn't just been about keeping a deed out of the wrong hand. It was about defending something far greater, the dignity of two people who had given their lives to this place, and the right for them to live out their final years without fear or coercion. The farm stood exactly as it had the day I first arrived to help, weathered fences, golden fields, and the old red barn standing proud against the horizon. It was untouched, unbroken, and firmly rooted where it belonged. George was gone, but his presence lingered in every worn floorboard, every creak of the porch swing, every row of crops Elaine still tended. I had kept my promise, even before I'd put it into words. This land would remain theirs, and now it would remain ours. Forever. What about you? Do you think Sarah was right to step in and protect her grandparents' home, or should she have let them handle it on their own? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious to hear your take. And if you like stories filled with family twists, courage, and quiet victories, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.